Welcome to the Kinder Institute seminar room here under the dome and over the pediment on the fourth floor of stately Jesse Hall in Columbia, Missouri. We have more TV stuff going, so I'm going to act like I'm on TV. My name is Jeff Pasley, professor of history here at the University of Missouri and associate director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. Today we're celebrating Constitution Day 2017. Now, if you're looking at the calendar, Constitution Day was actually on Sunday this year, so we decided to declare it Constitution Week with two speakers. We saw Professor Gene Allen Smith of TCU last night. Today, we have Professor Mary Bilder of Boston College Law School here in the same room. And we'd like to thank the Missouri Humanities Council for providing the grant that allowed us to double our enlightenment and add a second speaker this year. I'd like to say a tiny bit about what the Kinder Institute is for those people who may be coming for the first time. Founded in 2014, the Kinder Institute is a joint project between the University of Missouri Political Science and History departments in cooperation with other scholars across campus. It's dedicated to research, teaching, and community engagement on the subject of American political thought and history, seen in broad context and from a wide variety of perspectives. Was created by a generous gift from Rich and Nancy Kinder and their Kinder Foundation of Houston, Texas. These are people who have many choices about what causes and endeavors they could support with their philanthropy, and we feel so lucky that the humanities and social sciences here at MU are among those. So actually give a hand for them, please. Our hope at the Kinder Institute is to teach and learn about American constitutional democracy as the founders created it, though, of course, as we're going to learn from Mary, that's not actually even a simple question as to what that even means. And not just as the founders created it, we want to understand the ideas that inspired the founders, as well as the ideas that inspired the founders, as well as those they disagreed with and over. We want to understand our republic's shortcomings as well as its accomplishments, the changes it has gone through, as well as its eternal truths. Finally, and here's a big one, we want to model what we like to think of as the true spirit of deliberative constitutional democracy and of academia when it's properly understood. And that spirit is working intellectually toward enlightenment, liberty, and justice for all, and a renewal of our democracy through searching inquiry and vigorous discussion. And of course, to excuse the plug, you can read all about our programs at democracymissouri.edu or on Twitter at MU Democracy. Today, it's my great privilege to introduce our guest, Professor Mary Sarah Bilder of Boston College Law School. She's already been here for almost a day, and I'm sure many of you will already have been as impressed and humbled by the fact that we have to meet a scholar so accomplished in so many fields who could also be such a friendly and open person. So a lesson to us all on many levels. Mary's a true double threat, a well-trained lawyer who is also a historian's historian. To go to her official biography, Professor Mary Sarah Bilder teaches in the areas of American legal and constitutional history as well as property, trusts, and estates at Boston College Law School, where she is the founders professor, appropriately enough, she's the founders professor of law, named so in 2016. She did her undergraduate work as an English major at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, then her JD at Harvard Law School, and her AM and PhD from Harvard University in a program very near and dear to my heart, the History of American Civilization program. Don't call it American Studies. They don't know. They changed the name when we're not. The alum base is not happy. She was also a law clerk for Francis Murnahan Jr., U.S. Court of Appeals, Fourth Circuit. In addition to many articles, reviews, and at least one famous blog post, Mary is the author of two major books, The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture in the Empire, which is awarded the Littleton Griswold Prize from the American Historical Association, and is a work that we should all closely study here since it brings together so many of our respective interests in the Kinder Institute. Her most recent book, to talk about today, and that I should say is on for sale on the way out, if you enjoy today's talk, is Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, which was awarded the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography, though it's not really a biography. Why not? For the society, I don't mean either. For the Society for Historians of the Early Republic, and was named a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. And I can say personally that that's a prize it's only cool to be a finalist for. Richard Beeman called it an exceptionally important piece of work that will have a profound impact on all future work on the Constitutional Convention and change the way, and I'm sure it's going to change the way most of you think about James Madison and the constitutional debates that we are all so accustomed to citing. Mary has many, many other grants, awards, and honors, but the one we spent most time talking about at lunch was their work consulting for Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad, which she said she took her name off of because it is filled with all kinds of inaccuracies. They didn't listen to her, but she says she regrets now having taken her name off of it, so we're officially putting it back on right now. Anyway, Mary Sarah Bilder.
That's an absolutely delightful and far too kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I've actually never been to Columbia before, and so this has just been a wonderful visit for me. Let me begin by thanking Jeff and the Kinder Institute for the invitation. I believe that constitutional democracy as a field of study does not belong to one area. Law, political science, history, and literature all have things to say, and I really applaud interdisciplinary centers such as this one. I very much enjoyed working with Adam Seagrave on the starting point piece, and I liked visiting Jay Dow's class this morning, and Justin and Jeff and I had a great time doing their experimental podcast. So it's been a very filled day. Allison Smith was very helpful in arranging my day and acquiring a clicker for this talk. I went to the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate, and I truly believe in the essential importance of a state university. I'm enormously proud of us being a state university graduate, and so I'm so glad when I have the opportunity to speak at other state universities. Here's how I do these things. I'm a person who gets restless in talks. I just do. So there's lots of slides. There's like 42 slides, and I'm going to do it in 45 minutes. So if you blink, you're going to miss a slide. My slides have lots of pictures. It's kind of the picture book approach to the talk. I think I watched too many of those film strips when I was a kid where they said beep, and then they turned the picture. So I give talks a little bit like that. Columbia's a little bit like the place that I grew up in, Madison, Wisconsin, with a name that reflects American history. I always like to find out about a place I'm going to, and so I poked around about Columbia, actually from the old WPA guide, because that seemed to have the best information, and learned that the area was originally called Smithton, after Thomas Smith, who basically wasn't famous enough to keep the name. And so in 1821, when the settlement moved east, they renamed it Columbia, and the WPA guide says, for some, quote, unknown reason, which wasn't very satisfying. There's actually there's a wonderful article some years back by Thomas Schlereth in the Journal of American History on the idea of Columbia. And that article reminds us of how Columbia comes into being in large part through the work of the great African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley, who writes a very famous poem to George Washington, which configures America as Columbia. And then Columbia goes on. I actually have this because I own a cigar box with basically the Greater Columbia piece. And then of course there's Columbia when it was that. But so my own town that I grew up in was settled around the same time. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I sometimes wonder if that's what unconsciously led me towards James Madison later in my life. When I was a little girl, I never thought about why Madison was named Madison. Madison gets named that because a lawyer and former federal judge, James Doty, drew up the plans for the city. He owned 1,000 acres of land on the isthmus, so he had a personal interest in it. He had actually canoed over 4,000 miles in the upper Great Lakes, Mississippi, Fox, and Wisconsin rivers. Along the way, he learned Sioux, Winnebago, and Chippewa. And for years he argued that the proper way to spell Wisconsin was with a K. Personally, I kind of would have liked it. It would make, in this world, it look kind of like Marxist or something for Wisconsin, which in the world of Walker and Ryan would be highly amusing. In 1836, the year of the creation of the Wisconsin Territory, Doty laid out the plan for Madison. The plan is actually dated July 1st, 1836. Madison himself had just died, though Doty probably did not know it. And in Doty's plan for Madison, a radial series of streets moves out from the capital, configured after Washington, D.C., and those streets are named after the 39 signers of the Constitution. Now, growing up with the signers, albeit as streets, has proven useful in studying the Constitution. I know that Patterson, the delegate from New Jersey, who tried to protect equal state suffrage, spelled his name with one T. I know that Jennifer, a little-known delegate from Maryland, Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer, spelled his name with only one N. And I keep track of the men who did not sign, George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, and Edmund Randolph, Luther Martin, by asking myself, are they actually a street in Madison? And if the answer is no, then I'm like, oh yeah, they must not have signed the Constitution. But there's a larger problem. The names that are important in Madison bear an odd relationship to the actual convention. Take Mifflin Street, where the Mifflin Street Block Party in Madison was held during the Vietnam War in 1969. Thomas Mifflin was a Pennsylvania delegate who I think never appears in Madison's notes. And that's Mifflin, and there's Mifflin Street, and that's the Vietnam era of Mifflin Street. Landon Street and its neighbor Gilman Street loom large among University of Wisconsin students. They're the social area of the campus, but they're named for Thomas Langdon and Nicholas Gilman of New Hampshire, who arrived very late in the convention because they had to pay their own way. New Hampshire legislature refused to fund them. And one of the most important streets in Madison is actually Pinckney Street, which was named after one of the two Pinckneys, whose central purpose by the end of the convention was basically to ensure that Southern slaveholding interests would be protected in the new republic. So my sense of the names bears relatively little resemblance to the standard story of the convention. And I always think in some deep way, this disjunction helped me think about the framers and the convention in new ways. Now, one important purpose of history is to remind us that those in the past could not see the future. The great historian Bernard Bailyn writes, "What impresses the historian are the latent limitations within which everyone involved was obliged to act, the inescapable boundaries of action, the blindness of the actors. And the grand struggle of history is to try and see the past in a way that remembers that we know the outcome, but they did not." And this project is particularly difficult when we deal with the history of the Constitutional Convention, one of the great founding narratives of our nation. So this year is the 230th anniversary of the Constitution. My publishers are happy about that because when the book came out in the 227th year, they're like, you're never going to get any talks to go anywhere. No one celebrates the 227th year of anything. So they're happy we're now in a round number. Most of what we know about the convention, most of the story we tell comes from James Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention. Madison's notes are labeled a top treasure by the Library of Congress. And I have to pause here and tell you a story. You might see here on the screen, let's see if I can do this without blinding someone, it says top treasure number blank. It's actually got a number, but I'm not allowed to tell anybody what that number is. I know it, the library knows it. It was on all 500 slides they sent me originally. And then when my book was sent to them, because I wanted to make sure they were okay with it, they're like, where did you find out the number? And I'm like, it's on every slide you sent me. And they're like, okay, can you make sure you never show it to anybody? So when I do that, I cut it off. I mean, I'm sure you can FOIA it, okay? But I don't know what they think. Maybe, right, like people are going to go around and steal all the top treasures or something like that. They're located in the Madison building. Here's the Madison building. There's a little statue of Madison in it. Here's me. They celebrated Madison's 265th birthday party. David Stewart and I think he had a big cake. It was very jolly. There's Madison. This is the in the Smithsonian. This is the box that was thought to hold Madison's notes, and this is what the first page of the notes look like. And my book has been surprisingly controversial to me, certainly, for its claim that Madison was in part not taking the notes for us, for posterity. Madison, I believe, like the other members of the convention, did not know they were going to write the Constitution. Now, Madison himself did not cooperate with anniversaries. This is a famous Gibbs portraits by Gilbert Stuart for Colonel Gibbs in Rhode Island. People may know that Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, just coincidentally 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I've always been dubious about the coincidence. I think something happened. Okay, James Monroe, ever the dutiful president, right, he did the same thing. So he conveniently died on July 4th, not quite such a great year, the 55th, that was the best 5-year anniversary he could die on, okay. Washington died of a cold far earlier. He didn't understand you were supposed to die on a convenient date. But, right, it's pretty good, right, like those presidents. In 1836, Madison's health failed. And according to Dolly Madison's grandniece, the physicians wanted to, quote, prolong his life. So he would die on July 4th, 1836, the 60th anniversary of the Declaration. Madison refused to do this. He, quote, refused to take the necessary stimulants, probably opium. And he died on June 28th. You can see how annoying it was for some people, like 6 more days and you would have made it. Okay. He was 85 years old. And only after his death was the manuscript on the debates finally published. Now, before I tell you the story of Madison's creation of the notes, let me give you some background on the convention for people for whom it's not a highly familiar subject. In the summer of 1787, the Constitution was written. What do we have left of it? One engrossed Constitution, right there. One building. This is the Sing inkstand. It was used to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution. We have some chairs. We have these 2 nice drafts. These are actually Madisons Drafts, first and second draft of the Constitution. We know the general outlines of the story. The Constitution that first governed the country after the Revolution had only one branch of government, a unicameral Congress, and each state was represented by a delegation with 1 vote. That Constitution, we tend to refer to it as the Articles of Confederation, had no separate executive, no independent judiciary, and it required unanimous consent to amend. The framers thought they had a constitution, just not one that was working. And so Congress asked the states to send delegates to render the federal constitution, that is the government under the Articles of Confederation, adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of union. And so in the spring of 1787, 74 delegates were elected to the Constitution. 55 attended, 41 were present when the Constitution and Constitutional Convention adjourned on September 17th. Rhode Island never sent anybody. New Hampshire arrived late, and New York lost its vote after 2 of its delegates abandoned deliberately Alexander Hamilton so that he couldn't vote. Thomas Jefferson famously said of the convention, it was an assembly of demigods. But demigods can be hard to identify with when we want to understand what happened. This is a great example of how we convert these people into demigods. This is the famous Christie painting of the signing of the Constitution in the Capitol. And Madison, who's right here, is actually aged. So this is what Madison looks like more or less at the convention. This is a portrait done just a little bit before. He's 36 years old. But they use this portrait of him where he's 54 to put him here because, like, if you stick this super young looking guy in the picture, it's just not how we imagine it. I wanted to put this picture on my book, but my publisher said nobody will know that's Madison and they won't buy your book. So you should buy you should be like, oh, Madison, I will buy the book. Okay. George Washington seems completely out of our reach. A few of us were commander-in-chief of the country's army at 43, and I think it's very hard to imagine oneself as Ben Franklin, although Steve Jobs actually did, because he picked the Franklin biographer for his own biographer. Okay. Two of the most famous Americans were not at the convention. John Adams was at London. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris. This is a portrait Jefferson hated and tried not to have. This is Jefferson in Paris. It's not the Jefferson who comes back as the great Republican. This is Jefferson, the aristocrat, in Paris. Both have no idea they're missing out on the most important event in their lifetime. And I think in many respects, the mess they make of the country in the 1790s has to do with their own insecurities from having been absent. Other people are too exciting. Alexander Hamilton, killed in a duel, now a major Broadway play. James Wilson, always shown with little glasses, signifying, I don't know, geekiness like me, okay? Charles Pinckney, tainted irrevocably by his deep connections to slavery. And so I think people stumble on Madison and they often find in him something of themselves. He was short. Here I am at Montpelier sitting next to the life-size James Madison, so that gives you a sense of he was quite short. He only wore black suits. He was unlucky as a young man in romance, and then he married late in life the irrepressible Dolly Madison. He was son of a Virginia plantation owner who lived till 1801, and during Madison and his father's lifetime, approximately 100 enslaved people were held at Montpelier. At various times in his life, he was for states' rights against the national government, for national rights against the state governments, for majority rights against the minority, for minority rights against the majority. He wrote many of the Federalist Papers, is singularly responsible for the Bill of Rights, was a relatively successful two-term president, and in an 1836 eulogy, John Quincy Adams praised him as the father of the Constitution. But it's his note-taking at the convention, for which he is most famous. He left the only seemingly complete set of notes. He also outlived every other member of the convention. This wasn't surprising. His mother lived to be 97, and she died in 1829, long after Madison retired from the presidency, and only 7 years before Madison's own death. And as the other framers died, Madison kept track of their deaths. He actually kept track of their deaths. He knew who was still alive. And so when the rest were gone, he got the final word, what the historian Drew McCoy nicely terms being the last of the fathers. So how important are the notes? Over 600 books have been written on the convention, more articles than you can count. And each of them relies on that one document, Madison's Notes, because the notes provide our basic narrative. If you want to read one great book on the Constitution, read this one, Gene Fritz's book for kids. Shh, we're writing the Constitution. You read it, you're like, I know everything I need to know. It's a fabulous book, fabulous book. The notes remain the foundational text. They've been reprinted in many formats since their first publication in 1840. You can find them all over the web. And Supreme Court decisions refer to the convention notes. You're not supposed to be able to read this slide. It's just proof. I'm not making this up. This is my favorite new quote. I kind of disagree with the chief, with all due respect. Madison was the principal drafter of the Constitution, and he knew what he was talking about. Okay, I love that quote from Chief Justice Roberts. I have a little difference of opinion on it, but he's the chief and I'm not. Okay, lots of surprising amount in dissents in particular, the court referring to the convention. And the framers are part of popular culture, certainly among New Yorker readers. I love all of these because they blur the Declaration and the Constitution. Who knows which one they're really talking about, but they're all sort of like white guys in wigs with a big pen configured as the founders saying funny things. This is my own personal favorite. Now should we add something at the end about how wise we are, and therefore nothing in here should ever be changed. So my book is actually a biography of the notes. Madison's Notes are the most complete and detailed description of the convention. It's 136 and a half sheets of paper, 9 by 15 inches. They're folded in half with 4 pages of writing and some little slips. It ends up being about 500 pages. They're not the only record. We have an official record of the convention compiled by its secretary, William Jackson. This is the day where the Constitution is unanimously agreed to. And then I love this. The Constitution unanimously agreed to again. Okay, so who knows what happened there in the record, okay, but that's how the record is. It included a journal and a set of vote tallies. And we have notes from at least 10 other delegates. And these are all of them. Some people we don't have portraits of. But Madisons are the only ones that cover every day of the convention, beginning with May 14th and ending on September 17th, 1787. And no other set of notes depict the convention as Madison's notes do, as a political drama with compelling characters, lengthy discourses on political theories, crushing disappointments, miraculous successes. And the men who loom large in our story of the convention are the ones who intrigued or frustrated Madison. And so my book's not just a biography of the notes as a document, but also of Madison's view of the convention. So the book studies the notes as a text, but also as an artifact, a historical object. An artifact differs from a relic. The autographs of the framers were actually collected as relics in the 19th century. An artifact is a physical object with a particular history of composition. And that history of composition tells us things about the person and the moment that created it. And it's in this sense that the book is actually a biography of the notes. The most important thing about the notes is that they're covered with revisions. And this fact has always been known. When they were published in 1840, they were even described by Dolly Madison as revised by Mrs. Madison. And Madison actually left a little note here on the last page that he had not made all the revisions himself. But historians had avoided exploring the significance of the revisions, and the magnitude of them was underestimated. So when I first saw the manuscript in person in the conservation lab at the Library of Congress, this is not me. This is like famous people in the conservation lab, but it's the only picture I could find of it. The number of revisions and the degree to which they cover the manuscript was still a shock. And so to study the revisions, we put it on a little light table. This is what a light table looks like. You can see watermarks through that light table. Here's a watermark. And using that and a number of other versions of the manuscript that are extant, I actually created in a highly old-fashioned way a marked up low-tech colored pencil version of the manuscript. Okay, so I actually attempted to do this in computer and it failed, and I went to colored pencils. The revisions enhance the manuscript's significance because the story of the composition of the note emphasizes Madison and the other delegates' inability to perceive the extraordinary document the Constitution would become. And so tracing Madison's composition of the notes guides us back to a moment when the substance and fate of the Constitution remained uncertain. I mentioned one of the most important jobs of the historian is to try and recapture the past when people did not know what was going to happen. And so what was it like to be at the convention and not know it was the convention writing the Constitution? Certainly not. This is my favorite picture of the Constitution I've ever found on the web. This is the Constitution. And then this is like sleepover at the Constitution. They let all these kids sleep over in the hall. I don't think they'd allow that today. So let me tell you some things that happen when you look at Madison's notes. First, 3 sort of initial points about the manuscript emerge. First of all, although modern historians refer to them as notes, they've been relied on by scholars as if they were taken by a court reporter or a congressional stenographer. This is the image from C-SPAN when they turned the cameras off in 2016, and you really suddenly had this recognition of how different it is for the public not to be able to follow what goes on in Congress. I argue that the notes were an example of a legislative diary. In the 18th century, legislative proceedings were closed, like the Supreme Court deliberations remain today. And what the public had a right to was the final product, the legislation, and a formal journal of procedural motions. And newspapers occasionally published debates, but they were often quasi-fictionalized. Samuel Johnson's are the most famous of these. Indeed, although the House of Representatives would open its door in 1789, the Senate remains closed to the public until 1795. And so without published accounts of debates, legislators relied on private diaries in which they described political commitments, strategic blunders, not blenders. Madison kept a legislative diary in Congress before the convention, and he had shared that diary with Thomas Jefferson. And he also revised that diary. This is a great revision. Here it is, where he says right before the convention that I left New York for Philadelphia, because he didn't know it was the convention. And so later on he goes back, crosses out Philadelphia and says, for the convention, okay? Because now he knows in retrospect, like, I better make sure everyone realizes I was going to an important place. The second insight relates to the notes' reliability. They've been used as if they reflect a contemporaneous, complete account, but the notes were actually what historians would call a fair copy of more contemporaneous rough notes. I argue that Madison wrote them up likely twice a week. He was limited by available technologies, quill pen. He did not know shorthand. He used rough abbreviations, which would have been later difficult to sort out. His speed was limited. He wrote down at best 10% of what was said. And so twice a week on Wednesday and Sunday, Madison probably rewrote his rough notes into fair copy when he did his letters, and it would have required considerable creativity. I argue that the bi-weekly habit affected composition. The longest speeches appear in Saturday's notes. I suppose it could be people woke up on Saturday and they was like, hi, it's Saturday, I'll give a great speech, okay? But I argue that it's because a Sunday without meetings gave Madison time to decipher his rough notes, and he remembered a greater percentage of it. When Madison wrote about events of Monday and Thursday, therefore, he knew what the convention had gone on to decide, and those days were particularly written with hindsight. And so from the first beginning part of the notes, Madison is revising. I love talking about the notes with students because they know from firsthand you can't take notes when you're speaking. And when they're called on in class, which we do to people all the time in law school, students either leave their notes blank, or as they admit, they compose the section later, reflecting brilliantly on what they said as if it was the right answer. Here, this is my example of that, right? Speeches written afterwards. And so Madison's own speeches are the most troubling in terms of reliability. In fact, the book suggests that in the years following the convention, he might have replaced several of these to distance himself from statements that were later controversial. The process of writing the notes this way resulted in the strongest stylistic style of the notes. Madison imposed a consistent, detached style on the speakers. He used a third-person narrative voice, Mr. So-and-so, and most significantly, he summarizes the point of each speech at the outset. Nobody talks this way. He created a first-sentence summary that is so consistent that you can read the entire notes by just reading the first sentence of the speech. Undergraduates forced to read that. Remember it. It's true also of my book because I had read this so many times. I wrote my entire book this way, so you can also read my book just by reading the first sentence of every paragraph. Sorry you can't buy it that way. It would be much shorter. The notes were never, therefore, an objective record. They chronicled the discussions filtered through Madison's brain, and there was always distance between the notes and the convention. A third point relates to audience. People have read the notes as if Madison kept them for us, for posterity. And Madison might have had some idea about this. But I think they were written largely for himself to keep track of the positions of allies and opponents, and for Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was in Paris, and Madison had shared his congressional notes with him. And he promised to take and share these notes of the convention. He writes Jefferson that in July 18th, in the middle of the convention. And so in this regard, I think the notes, interestingly, belong to accounts that emphasize Madison and Jefferson as collaborators. So what do the notes tell us originally about Madison in the summer of 1787? The notes for June and July are fixated on Madison's almost obsessive desire to create a powerful national government with proportional representation in both houses. More than anything, he wanted the states to lose their representation in Congress. The notes show that Madison opposed thoroughly and completely the Federalist compromise that our modern Congress embodies, in which the House represents population and the Senate the states. Virginia would have benefited enormously from bicameral proportional representation. It held nearly 300,000 people, enslaved nearly half the enslaved population in the United States. And the notes show that the small states' anxiety was as much about Virginia's possible future political power as any concern about a philosophy of state sovereignty. And you can see there on the graph, Virginia's the bottom line, and any way you count it, it far dominates the other states. The unrevised notes show how Madison encouraged the development of a Southern voting bloc. He thought that by persuading the 3 Southern states to join the 3 largest states, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, in a voting coalition, he could get proportional representation in both houses. And so in late June and July, Madison repeatedly hinted at a sectional division between northern and southern states over slavery. He even proposed that Congress reflect that division with one branch representing free white inhabitants and the other representing all people, free and enslaved African Americans, but enslaved African Americans would not vote. And so Madison's plan would have given profound voting power to states that legalized slavery. That idea was never adopted. But Madison's insistence on a sectional divide over slavery, his suggestion in the convention that the slave states needed to protect their interests in the national government, I believe instigated the dynamic that led to the 5 constitutional provisions protecting slavery and to the 3/5 clause, which would give the slave states disproportionate power in the early republic. After leaving the convention, Madison would go on to always blame South Carolina and Georgia for the compromise over slavery, and his notes, when published in the 19th century, would become cited as proof of an unavoidable compromise, but I think Madison was equally at fault. His willingness to embrace slavery in the Constitution reflected his own personal compromise over slavery. He believed it to be against the principles of the Revolution, but he could not imagine a multiracial American nation. Madison freed no one at his death, and indeed his will left the profits of the notes, when published, to the American Colonization Society, the group dedicated to sending free African Americans back to Africa, specifically Liberia. And so Madison's a part of the long history of race, right, that creates this wonderful portrait. This is my favorite portrait of the President Obama taken during his administration of him on the Rosa Parks bus. The original notes also show Madison's considerable talent for drafting. By the first draft on August 6th, Madison had lost many of his key ideas. The states had lots of control. He was upset, and everyone knew it, and he wasn't put on the first draft committee. But he copied the August 6th draft language into his notes, and by doing that became as familiar with that draft as the men who served on the committee. And with this new role, he turned out to show a talent for semantic compromises that sidestepped theoretical disputes. And repeatedly in August, he pushes for the Constitution to have more broad general powers. But the unrevised notes also show us how complicated the drafting began in the final weeks. In late August, the delegates began to send all the controversial issues to committees. And for the first time, Madison is now chosen for the 3 most important committees, one dealing with slavery, one on all the postponed matters, and the final draft committee. But he became sick, something that he was susceptible to under stress. And so I argue Madison stopped writing up his rough notes, that he never finished them, and that the notes after August 21st do not date to the summer of 1787. I believe he was too involved in drafting to bother writing up his rough notes, and moreover, that it was probably impossible for him to disentangle the debates and decisions in the important committees from those on the convention floor. And so at the very moment when the convention decided many of the issues that we debate today, congressional powers, impeachments, the vice president, the electoral college, presidential powers like the treaty power, the grouping and relationships that converted 23 articles into the final 7, the notes are most likely not contemporaneous. But the collapse of the notes emphasized what I think is the far more important fact. The delegates could not see the Constitution the way we do as a coherent synthetic document. They were desperately trying to write a draft to save the country. Now, do Madison's understandings change after the convention? I think so. Madison joined Hamilton to write the Federalist essays. In his best essay, by my opinion, Federalist 37, he insisted that the Constitution had not been written by, quote, an ingenious theorist in his closet or his imagination, and he cautioned those who would look for, quote, artificial structure and regular symmetry. But as he continued to try and persuade opponents, Madison began to construct rationales for the Constitution and to write as if there had been a single intent. In June of 1788, Madison attended the Virginia Ratification Convention, and he explained the Constitution there in ways to appeal to Virginia slaveholders and pro-Virginia advocates. And he began to deny there had been efforts to consolidate the government and diminish the role of the states. As a member of the First Congress, Madison repeatedly confronted the difficulty of interpreting the Constitution. In 1789, in the First Congress, Madison confronted textual ambiguity. This is the first removal power debate. And with delight, he said, the Constitution, this is the quote, does not perfectly correspond with the ideas I entertained of it from first glance. He's like, I don't even know what it means. And then I think most importantly, in June of 1789, Madison proposed amendments to the Constitution. He wanted them incorporated into the original text. Madison thought the amendments should be interwoven, and that would not have any original text over time, that you just revise the document itself. Roger Sherman insisted that the amendments be supplemental. He said the sacred Constitution was lodged in the archives of Congress and it shouldn't be altered. And Congress agreed. The original 12 amendments were sent out to the states for ratification with the intent that they be added supplementally. And I think only with this decision was it clear that the text created by the 1787 convention would forever remain visibly intact. Only at that moment does the convention and Madison's notes take on new relevance and interpretive possibility. Now, why does Madison bother to complete the notes? Jefferson returns in the fall of 1789. If you've seen Hamilton, you know this is the division between the first and second acts. Jefferson comes back with a great song, What Did I Miss? I'm not going to try and sing it because I have a bad voice. That's emblematic right there. Madison finishes the notes now. He secretly acquires the official journal of the convention from George Washington. We don't know how because George Washington's diaries for that month are mysteriously missing. Madison makes a copy. This is Madison's copy, secret copy of the journal. He begins his copy with August 20th, which is where his notes had basically stopped, and then he returns to copy the beginning of the journal. And Madison then used the journal to make sense of whatever rough notes he had. And so far more from than the original notes, the post-August 21st notes that I believe were written after the fall of 1789 focus on textual alterations. Madison basically now writes up the notes, inserting all the technical language from the journal. And then he goes back over his own notes and revises them like that. So here's an example. Here's Charles Pinckney. He introduces rights, and Madison records that proposal of rights, and Madison records that proposal in classic Madison style, so very broad, large terms, not detailed. And that's obliterated from our understanding because Madison eventually instead revises his notes to include all of Pinckney's crazy technical language. And so this part, which is remarkably similar to the rights as Madison will introduce them, is missing, and this, which creates the sense that there's no continuity between this and Madison's later understanding of rights, is what we inherit. Now, as Madison revised the notes to convert his diary into a record of debates, he converted himself into a different Madison. In the original notes, Madison is grumpy, irritated, and annoyed. I called him catty in my book, but lots of historians are really unhappy about that. I think sort of all the things in my book you could be unhappy about, the fact that I called him catty didn't strike me as the biggest one. But Madison, by altering a word, a phrase, turns himself into the moderate, dispassionate, and thoughtful intellectual founder of the Constitution. In the 1790s, Madison made further revisions to suggest convention support for Jefferson's politics. Jefferson returns to see the world through the lens of the French Revolution. Supporters of Republican government versus monarchists. And here's the number one monarchist over there, Alexander Hamilton. Madison shared his notes with Jefferson. Jefferson had his young relative studying law with him, John Epps. John Epps copies the manuscript, and I believe the notes created or certainly encouraged Jefferson's obsession with the idea that Alexander Hamilton was a secret monarchist. Madison also at this point replaces some of his own speeches, particularly ones in which he had been heard by others to make statements that now were opposed to Jefferson's visions. Madison later said about this whole period that many of his actions were too often tinged with the party spirit of the time. So he actually regrets a lot of what goes on in the 1790s. By 1796, I think Madison's notes were all in place. And in December of 1796, Madison announced his retirement from politics. That month, Jefferson had become vice president to President John Adams. Jefferson urged that Madison publish the debates. He thought Madison's notes would support Jefferson's interpretation of the Constitution against John Adams, and he thought it would undermine the Adams administration. Madison demurred. Firstly, he worried that Jefferson had not read the entire notes, and I'm not sure Jefferson had, and he worried that the notes would not support Jefferson's interpretation. Moreover, he thought other people might have different recollections, and those other reports would not necessarily confirm Madison's version. He explained it was a problem what turn might be given to the impression on the public mind. Nothing in the notes, let me find my page here. Nothing in the notes would damage Jefferson's reputation, but for Madison, publication weighed differently. Madison's concerns about the notes triumphed and they were not published. Jefferson moves on to a totally different interpretation in which the Constitution is a compact, and perhaps with relief, Madison put the notes away. After retiring from the presidency in 1817, Madison returned to his notes to revise them to create the appearance of comprehensiveness. He added more revisions from the Journal, now published in 1819 by John Quincy Adams. He inserted missing sections of speeches paraphrased from Yates's notes. Madison had criticized these notes publicly, but he copies some of them over in his own notes, and then he and his brother-in-law prepared a transcript in which the notes would appear among Madison's letters that would explain the larger context. Although he repeatedly during these years flirted with publication, he refrained. He constantly worried about other accounts. Not until 1827 and 1828 did the other three most significant note takers, Rufus King, John Lansing, and William Jackson, die. And so only in 1829 is Madison the only living member left, and at that point he's settled on posthumous publication. Madison's will left the notes to Dolly Madison. Publishers failed to offer a satisfactory amount, and friends in Congress eventually agreed to buy them for $30,000 along with the other papers. And so in 1840, Madison's Notes were finally published in the 3-volume collection. Now, countless historians have repeated a statement in this introduction that reassured readers of the contemporaneous accuracy of Madison's Notes. But Madison actually never wrote in his own hand that the notes had been written that summer in their entirety. And you can see here the claim in italics that's in Dolly Madison's handwriting. Madison wrote in his own hand, "I was enabled to write out my daily notes during the session or within a few finishing days after it's closed." And then Dolly Madison added, "in the extent and form preserved in my own hand in my files." Madison may have consented to the addition. That's his handwriting right there in the insertion problem, probably. But he never actually wrote it himself. I believe Madison had never settled on the precise relationship of his notes to the Constitution. Over the years that Madison worked on the manuscript, his smallest revisions subtly altered the meaning of the Constitution and the Convention. And this is my favorite one. It's on the very first page of the very first sentence. In the unrevised notes, the very first sentence reads, and that's up here, "Monday, May 14th was the day fixed for the meetings of the deputies in convention for revising the federal Constitution. The United States prior to the convention is described as under a federal Constitution." But many years later, and this is a very late change, Madison altered that word. He crossed out the word Constitution and he replaced it with system of government. And so instead of a word, Constitution, that was originally broad enough to refer to the world under the Articles, the word had now come to have only one meaning, the 1787 Constitution. The meaning of Constitution as a word and concept had morphed in the process of drafting, ratifying, disputing, interpreting, and living under the Constitution. And so with this revision, the notes now began with the confirmation that the very purpose of the convention had been to transform a country under a federal system of government to one under a federal constitution. But only in retrospect could Madison see the importance of that moment and the new meaning of the word Constitution. Madison understood his revisions as repeated efforts to create a record, his record, of what he saw as significant in the convention. But every revision increased the distance from the summer of 1787. His notes as a historical text, as an artifact, reveal this distance. Over the years and decades, words, concepts, compromises shifted focus, took on new political meanings. Motivations were disputed. Context was lost. The convention could not see the Constitution until the final days, and from that moment, the Constitution was contested. The respect that we owe the framing generation demands appreciation for the political world in which they struggled to stabilize the country. Madison worried, if the present moment be lost, it's hard to say what may be our fate. And the understandings of the Constitution shifted, though, over the summer of 1787 and continued to transform through that fall into 1788, 89, 91, 96, 99. Over the first decade, the Constitution survived and began to become the Constitution. But only with hindsight did the meaning of the convention and the Constitution begin to be shaped. Madison's narrative was always that of James Madison, a member. Beginning in 1787 and continuing for a half a century afterwards, he struggled to understand what had happened that summer. And that's a struggle that continues into our own day. It's been a great privilege to speak here. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay, we have time for a few questions, and the ground rules is I have to this is a dated reference, but I have to Phil Donahue it and hand you this microphone. So, who's got a question for Mary?
I'll answer any question about anything.
Go ahead. That's easy. Thank you.
How long do you think it will be before we have another constitutional convention?
Oh, another constitutional. Well, there are people who very much would like to see a constitutional convention right now. When I go to a lot of places, Missouri is probably one of them, and Wisconsin, lots of people who would like a new constitutional convention, and a lot of legislatures have joined that effort. I'm conservative on this grounds. People may know there's two ways to amend the Constitution that the Constitution provides. One, you can do it the way that all of our amendments have. You propose them, they go out to the states. The Constitution also provides for the possibility of calling a new convention. And most historians argue that the reason that mechanism has never been used is because you cannot control the agenda. That is, once a whole bunch of people get in the same room, you will end up rewriting the whole Constitution, and so that it is better to proceed on an item-by-item basis. There are some people who think you can control the agenda. I personally think the agenda is uncontrollable at that point. So there are people who would like to see a new convention. I'm probably not one of them. I think there's a lot of safety valves built into the Constitution, and so at present I'm kind of okay with the slow piece, but I'm a small c conservative on this one.
Thank you for that talk. I was intrigued by the slides you had of the conservation setup with the light boxes at the Library of Congress. And as you mentioned, as soon as it was published, people knew that these were revised in some way, shape or form. So I thought I'd just ask if you could elaborate on what part of your interpretation came from the sort of the light boxes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so sort of how does the fact that they were revised and what part of various historical methods accomplish this? They said they were revised, but they were published as Madison wanted them published at the end of his life. So for most of the 19th century, you could not have known what the revisions were, and there's a number of people, particularly political theorists, who believe, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with this, who believe that we should study Madison's Notes as a text that, as of the 1830s, was what Madison believed about the convention. And I think that's, as a historical matter, okay. It's just that we don't. We tend to study as a text that tells us what happened in 1787. Only in the late 19th century, because it was you couldn't see, the notes were in the State Department, and so in the late 19th century, historians and political scientists felt that the government didn't give them access, and so in response, the State Department created a transcript, and they went through the manuscript and they created it's incredibly large, transcript of every revision that was in the manuscript and what they could tell. So they basically created a verbatim transcript. And then historians, particularly I think some editors like Max Ferrand, were like, well, that's too complicated, so we'll ignore most of the revisions. And so at that point, the revisions were more or less, again, forgotten, and most texts don't show the revisions. So I used that transcript in large part as the basis for sorting out the revisions. But what that transcript can't tell you is whether all the pages were intact. And watermark evidence had been cited in 1987. The library had commissioned some people to look at the manuscript, and because there always, in Madison's lifetime, people had said they didn't think the manuscript was all together. Hamilton's son had believed that Madison had been dishonest or disingenuous about what his father had said. So there always were sort of murmurings around it. And in 1987, people looked at the manuscript and the watermarks and said, well, no, it looks like they're all the same pages. But that was before you could shoot with a digital camera a watermark. And so watermark technology was either very expensive, you had to use a very expensive kind of camera, which meant you never shot all the pages, or you had to hand draw them, and they never went through the whole manuscript. So I created an interpretive record where I had pages that I thought, from a traditional historical interpretive sense, there seemed to be something funny about. You had a funny sense of the way it was. and the library agreed to reshoot using their very high-powered cameras a certain number of pages to check the watermarks as a test. And so I guessed, I was basically like 80%, 85% accurate on the pages I guessed. I overshot a couple, and then we, using that, created a sort of taxonomy of watermarks and then went back through the entire manuscript. And what that showed was the watermarks in the first 2/3 of the manuscript were all matching, but for a few places with Madison's speeches. And the last third of the manuscript all matched, but completely different. And then if you compare that to the journal, the last third of the manuscript is mostly verbatim the journal. And it's not added in. You can tell Madison had the journal next to him, but he couldn't because you were barred during the convention from having the journal, from looking at the journal. In the first 2/3 of the manuscript, Madison's inserted the journal back in, which meant that he had a copy of the journal at the time he wrote the last third. So that's a long story to say, like, an awful lot of evidence went into it, and then the challenge of the book was to tell the story without overwhelming everybody with that evidence. So the evidence is all in the last part of the book in an appendix called Evidence. And a couple reviews of the book have been like, you should really read the last part of the book first, because that's where everything exciting is. And I'm like, not for most normal people. like really no.
Okay, there was a gentleman back here who stayed back here.
Tell me about how you think the Supreme Court properly or improperly uses the notes, given that you can probably find anything you want in them.
Yeah, you can find anything you want in them, just like the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. I mean, tens of thousands of pages, so you can find anything that you want. I think that if there's a major misconception about the Supreme Court and originalism, it's that there's a difference between originalism and history. So I believe that there is a place for historical context in the interpretation of the Constitution. I think that's incredibly important. But I do not think it is the binding and only way to interpret the Constitution. And what originalism claims is that the only legitimate way of interpreting the Constitution is what the text meant as of that time, or arguably what the people who wrote it or ratified it meant. And so I think there's a space on a whole lot of the amendments to understand what were the concerns that motivated this. And then a much harder question, which is why I'm a historian, not a Supreme Court justice, about what's the role of the Supreme Court today in deciding what you do with that information, given this time period. I'm somebody who does not want the Constitution to have to be rewritten, so I'm actually comfortable with the fact that the courts over the last 225 years have come to interpret the Constitution in a way that allows it to move over time. I happen to think that is right, but as I say, I would never want to be a judge, and I'm glad 9 other people have that responsibility, and I can just tell you what it meant back then.
First of all, fabulous presentation. I was very, very interested. I'm curious, you keep referring to it as the manuscript, and I'm wondering, in the course of decades of revisions, at what point might he have thought, let me grab some fresh paper and make a new version? Are there multiple versions?
Yeah, so there are. It's a great question. There are multiple versions of it. Let's see if I can go back here. There's Madison's version. There's Madison's version itself. He kept basically his fair copy and he added to it. There's this version over here, which is what he and his brother-in-law created, which is the transcript. That's actually the one that was used when they published it. There's this copy, which is a copy that Jefferson made of the manuscript very early on, and so it was useful to me because it gave a sense of, I argue Jefferson borrowed it in the 1790s, so it tells you what the manuscript looked like in the 1790s. Jefferson was an obsessive copyist, so there's actually a copy of this copy in partial because Jefferson, at the time he copied this, was really obsessed with a kind of copying where you wrote the copy and then you scrunched another page on top of it and you created a blurred copy. This is before Jefferson develops a copy machine, buys a copy machine that lets you have 2 copies. And so there's a partial copy of this copy at the New York Public Library. That copy of a copy was never altered, so I used that copy of a copy to tell me what had it looked like at the moment that Jefferson did it. So there were these multiple copies. There's lots of things that I can't explain about the manuscript at all. One of the things that is obvious from the Jefferson copy is that at the time that it was copied by John Epps, the manuscript was in 2 sections. One section with the first 2/3, and then this August 22nd to the end section was bound by itself because Epps copies it that way. And there's places where Madison was still revising it. So there's a section that the paper's obviously been substituted that involves the president's treaty power. And Epps gets to that place and he said, there's a page missing. And Madison later on put that page back in, but that's not in the Jefferson copy because obviously Madison was revising it at that time. So there are those multiple versions. I think a fascinating question is, why did Madison not get rid of the notes himself? And that, I'll end with that one interesting fact. Madison left his papers and the notes to Dolly Madison. And what he thought was going to be published was the Payne transcript, the transcript that his brother-in-law had created. It's not clear to me he thought that anybody would necessarily get that original thing. And in fact, when Congress bought it, she sent the Payne transcript that would not have shown you that it was revised really at all to Washington to be deposited in Congress. And Senator Reeves, who had been involved with it, wrote a letter and was like, what are you doing? We don't want this transcript, we want the original thing. And it's only because Reeves fusses that the Madison notes survive. I think otherwise, Dolly Madison's niece burns a lot of her papers, and so I think it's almost that just strange sense that Reeves was like, wait, you got to send us the manuscript, not the copy. That is why we can even figure this out today.
Oh, it's you too?
Fantastic paper. My question's really about the context of this kind of doctoring of historical sources, because the story that you've told of Madison's notes could be told of all sorts of the famous state papers of the 19th century. You think of Doug Wilson's book on Lincoln's speeches and the revisions that they go through. I'm very familiar with John Quincy Adams's diary, which also is a very problematic source for very similar reasons. So my question is, when you look at all these stories together to sort of connect the dots, are there common denominators? Is there an informal kind of gentleman's code about what you can and cannot do? And are there informal mechanisms which sort of regulate this, the mechanisms for which one might revise these sorts of documents? So to take the story away from the Constitution and into 19th century state papers, it's problematic for historians to think about this, but if we can find the sort of rules of the trade, if there are any, and I guess that's my question. So how typical or atypical is the Madison story that you're telling?
Yeah, so I actually think it's more typical than not, and that for a variety of complicated reasons, including the fact that we tend to think our history is not that old. We have been uncomfortable thinking about our sources this way. If you do British history, right, lots of British history depends on understanding that there were revisions. That's a whole interesting thing about it. So European and UK historians, they would be like, yeah, like what? Like, why are you even bothering to write this book? Hasn't somebody written this book like 9 times before you? So partly it's the fact that American historians have tended to be reluctant, I think, to alter a sort of received text. I think part of it's the fact that only really, in some ways, now that we can see so many of these documents, is the degree to which regular historians can do it. It's very hard to do it through documentary editions. I'm less convinced there was an understanding of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And I'll just give you one example from Madison's notes themselves. When Madison goes back, this is late. This is after 1819, and he has Yates, who's this person he's criticized, he hates, who accused him of being a consolidationist, which he probably was, and he publicly criticized Yates. But he goes through Yates's notes and he adds back in things that he missed. But he doesn't add them back in like, see Yates, I'm adding this all in. He adds them in by, he flips the beginning and ends of Yates's sentences, and he substitutes synonyms. And Max Ferrand figured this out in 1911 when he published his edition, but he was so worried about it that he was like, he sort of mentioned it and then scurried to reassure people that he didn't think it was a real problem. But, I mean, basically Madison added in a source that he had publicly criticized. He disguised his edition of that source, and he never said anything. So, you know, like, it's hard, like, is that acceptable or not? I don't know. I mean, I think that, to be fair to him, I think he did not believe that we would get to a point where people would be thinking that it was the truth, as opposed to, well, hey, I'm just a guy who was there, these are my notes. But he himself participated a little bit in that.
So this won't be a bestseller in the UK?
Yeah, it won't be a bestseller in the
Okay.
UK at all.
My question is, it deals with most of writing about how we're going to govern ourselves is impacted by economic factors. And the one you mentioned primarily is slavery, but were there others? Can you tell that in the notes, other economic factors impacting the debates and the results of his notes?
Yeah, so I think for me, you know, one of the things that I do in the book is I tried very hard not to retell the story of the convention itself completely. So what I tried to do was talk about places where, looking back at the unrevised notes, trying to recreate the original notes, would give you a sense of where the standard story maybe didn't have it quite right. And so that's why I really focused on slavery, because slavery is a part of the standard story. It is part of the economics of the standard story. But in the standard story, the division is the Deep South as a slave economy against a sort of growing quasi-capitalist banking, you know, Philadelphia and New York, a commercial enterprise. And that's in the notes itself. Curiously, in that story, the Virginians come off invisible. You know, it's sort of like everybody's looking at the two sides, and there's Virginia, and there's like, hey, we're just there, you know? And Madison himself, I think, perpetuated some of this. And so for me, part of the slavery story is that a lot of work now on Virginia has talked about, you know, the Virginians were in a terrible situation economically. You know, people like Jefferson, they're all in debt. It's not clear where the future is going to be for the Virginians. And so I think, and this is very true at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, they are completely terrified, just as terrified as the South Carolina and Georgia people, about what will happen if the government abolishes slavery. And so I do think that commercial piece, once you realize that, then that complicates the story in which it's the Deep South versus sort of proto-capitalists in the North. But I think if you went back through the notes, you could find a lot of other commercial stories coming out of it. And Mike Klarman's new book really does try and emphasize the economic piece, because that's very much what he's interested in. He does a nice job of that.
So from the student's perspective, and being that you're a professor, it's almost like a two-part question. But did your research change the way in which you describe the Constitutional Convention to your students? And if you had the choice, would you assign the notes to your students?
Yeah, great questions. Let me take the second one first. I do assign the notes. I don't assign my book because I somehow feel like it's unethical to like make people buy my own book for my class. So I Xerox like mad. Forget that. I'm not casting aspersions on anybody who does that. But it's like I felt uncomfortable about that. So I do assign the notes. We talk a lot about how we'd want to read the notes, not necessarily as an objective truth, but as one person's account. And so I think in that sense, we have lots of famous accounts in which we have to be thoughtful about whether the narrator, the author, is reliable. And so in that sense, I think that's, I think that's a sort of interesting piece. And wait, the first part of your question, I was like so interested in the last part, I forgot the first part, was?
Did what you learned from your research change the way in
Oh
which
yeah, well,
you
the way I
teach
taught.
it?
Yes, totally. And I'll give you. I actually think slavery is the biggest example. I graduated from graduate school in an era where it was still common among certainly respectable historians to say slavery was at the convention, but it wasn't the moving force of the convention. It was sort of there, but it didn't animate every decision. I graduated from graduate school at a time when that was still a common thing, and you could find books that wrote that. And I had already moved away from that position, but in going back to Madison's Notes, I think particularly his effort to embed slavery even more explicitly in the very way that Congress would be formed, I now think that that far more than we appreciate, the convention is founded on this sort of moment where for the first time people really begin to appreciate that there's a fundamental question in the country about what's going to happen with slavery, and that there are people like Morris and others who realize there are people who will go to their deaths to defend the right to own other people. And there are people on that side who realize that there will be people who, beginning the day they walk into Congress, be trying to come up with a way to abolish it. And so for me, what really changed was the degree to which I do think that what happened in Philadelphia for a lot of people was a moment where everybody began to understand that was a central dividing question that the nation was going to have to face. And you can see that because Madison goes back to Congress and he tries to sink every petition that shows up from people who are trying to limit slavery. So I think in my own teaching, I now very much teach about the way in which slavery created the kind of racial injustices we see today, that we are founded in a country that really hasn't come to terms with the degree to which the great wealth of this country came from people who were enslaved. And so I think the emphasis for me in teaching has changed in that regard.
Discussion can continue for a little while after here. We have a reception outside and a table where you can buy the books. Did they leave? The books left? They're still here? Okay, all right. It's false alarm. Yes, you can buy books. There's a reception outside. Thank you all for coming. Let's have a big hand for Mary Sarah.